Okay, now we're going to take a look first at some of the common cultural values that you hold to personally and that I may hold to. And then we're going to link those specific actions that represent those cultural values to in activities or behaviors that we would all engage in life. And then we're going to look at some of the ways in which differences in cultural value challenge our understanding or our ability to evaluate the worldview of another person. And so first, let's begin to think then about some of our cultural values. We're going to ask you in this activity, as we go through, to identify your own personal position on these values, 8 continuums in a sense, that describe some fairly fundamental areas of culture. And these descriptions that we give are referring to overall areas of cultural value. And we want to think about which end of the spectrum in each of these areas on the continuum, which one matches best where we are. And actually mark your position in this case then on the continuum to identify what you would see as your own personal cultural value in a particular area. And then after you note your position on a continuum, then go ahead and write an example that is describing how that value is expressed or has worked itself out in specific ways in your life. Try to think of some specific examples that how it's displayed in your attitudes and your actions in life. And for example, one of them will be a polychronic and monochronic description of a value of time. And so maybe for you, you tend not to be a person who is overly concerned about being late, about timeliness. And so in each of these areas then, wanting you to think about whether your value, the value that you're representing, the place where your value is on that continuum, whether that's a result of your Christian theistic worldview or not? Or is it more of a general cultural value that doesn't really have connection points per se to your Christian theism itself? So let's talk about some of these common areas of cultural value that I trust many people would identify with. The first of them is the continuum of self versus group identification. That on the one end of the one extreme, the one end, that a primary identification point for a person is with just themselves. It's a type of individualism. That the self is the smallest unit of survival in society. That therefore self-reliance and personal freedom and even emotional distance from others become very important. If each person protects themselves, then in that process they're going to guarantee the well-being of others around them, because those others will be protecting themselves. And so identity really is part of the function of individual achievement. So that's one end of this continuum. And then on the other end, as you see and would understand, that there's another way to identify, which is in groups. That identity is actually a function of membership in a group. That the smallest unit of survival is the group itself, not the individual, but the group. And therefore, people in the group need to be interdependent, look after one another, ensure the well-being of one another, and in the process, that group identity helps the individuals be protected or find well-being. That people are in need of close affiliation with the others in their group, and that too much freedom, too much individualism can actually be seen as scary. So think about those two extremes in the continuum and identify your place there. And then a second value that we would identify or relate to is this issue of egalitarianism versus an in-group mentality. On the one extreme, an egalitarian mentality is what's norm, meaning that group membership is casual, it's less defined, and it's more voluntary. That there's no strong sense of in and out group in this value. That most people are treated the same. They're informal in their relationships, both with friends and with strangers. Perhaps that It's easy to move in and out of groups, to change groups if you like, and to make friends in another group. Less well-structured and defined group identity in that sense. So that would be an egalitarian mentality. And then the other extreme of the continuum is the in-group mentality, which indicates that people are very close and intimate in their relationships with each other, and then they would be in competition in a sense with others. So out-groups, groups that aren't in-group. And they have formal relationships with all, but they're in-group. There's a formality to those relationships. They don't trust the out-groups inherently. And the group boundaries are very fixed. They don't change easily. And then therefore it becomes harder to make friends with people who are on the in the out group. And so think about that. In your life, which of these extremes would you most identify with? A third value that we want you to think about is autonomy versus collective society. That in the autonomy end of the spectrum, that autonomous organizations or identities are prevalent. Workers in this system are more independent of each other. That there's a sense of individual recognition and achievement. And any kind of decision making is by majority rule, because the opinion of each individual matters in the decision-making process, that there's less loyalty to the organization as a structure, and that results are really significant. People are rewarded according to the way they contribute to the organization because of their individual identity there, and autonomous identity. And then the other end of that value spectrum that for you to think about is that there could be a scenario where collective organizations prevail, where teamwork and cooperation and group recognition and loyalty. So the idea of the group receiving recognition from the organization, that would be the norm. That would be the value. That decision making is consensus rather than individual voices spoken. And that harmony in the group itself, collectively, is really important. It's key. And that any rewards that the group would earn are given and distributed equally to the group because of the value of the participation of all the members working together collectively. So think about that value and where you fall in relationship to that. And then another value, the idea of what we would describe as a universalism versus a particularism. Universalism, as the rule, says that personal and social obligations are of equal importance and they should be balanced. Rules should be applied equally to the in-group, those within the group, and then to the society in general. And so what is right is always right, regardless of the circumstances. The end and means are always working together well. That objectivity in evaluating it it's important, and it would be expected. That's the universalist kind of mindset or value. And then particularism describes a contrast to that it's necessary to distinguish between the in-group and the societal obligations around. That the in-group responsibilities are important, but the out-group or the societal obligations are less so in this particularistic mindset. That it's being fair is to treat the in-group well. That's what fairness means. And let those in the out-group fend for themselves. Let the society rise or fall on its own terms. That what is right depends on the situation that impacts the in-group. And therefore, the context of decisions, the context of evaluations are really crucial to correct action. And therefore, there's a subjectivity in decision-making that's valued and that's in fact expected in a particularist context. And so as you think through your life experience, where do you tend to fall in universalism and particularism? Another value, the idea of a view of time, which affects a lot of us and we think about often, and we see it play itself out in this idea of monochronic versus polychronic attitudes towards time. That those who are monochronic, they tend to be ready and commonly adjusting to the demands of time, that time is important to them. The time is seen as a limited resource, and so sometimes people are too busy to see you because the limited resource of their time is being applied in other ways. People living in this way, in this idea of monochronism, in accordance with that external clock that we're always conscious of. And then the other extreme to that is polychronic people. For those who are focused on more of the relationships or the people around them, that their attitude towards time is more flexible. Time is bent or changed to modified because the needs of people need to be met. And so people are in a polychronic mindset aren't too busy for relationship. There's always more time. Time is not a limited resource, a carefully controlled resource. People live more, rather than by an external clock, they're living by the internal clock of that which propels them towards a relationship. So, in many of our interpersonal relationships, we see differences in that monochronic view versus a polychronic view. So where are you? Where are you in that value? Another important value in evaluating our cultures, our own personal culture, and the culture of the society where we live, is how we approach the doing of tasks. Some of us, on the one end, are people who can do one thing at a time. That for example, standing in a single, think of the image of standing in a single file line, expecting in the process of that one particular task an undivided attention given to the accomplishment of that task. That when I get interrupted, that's a bad thing. That when a schedule is changed or a deadline isn't met, that's negative, because those are important. That being late or turning in something late is bad. That I need to be adhering to schedules and goals that have been set out for me, even by myself. That my plans shouldn't be and aren't easily changed. Those are the kind of one thing at a time values that people bring to bear in their lives. And then the other extreme, as we see, is some people are what we think of as multitaskers. They do many things at once. They're standing in line less in some societies, more of a crowd kind of mentality, that divided attention is okay. It's not that big of a deal to be trying to negotiate multiple things at once, that interruptions occur and they should be expected. Schedules and deadlines are much more loose, and they don't give specific guidance to our lives. Late is just late. It's no big deal. That completing the transaction itself eventually is the goal, not the schedule of events that lead to the completion. And plans, future plans and present plans can be easily changed. Not such a big deal. So again, as you think through that value, where are you? In multi versus single task, one thing versus many things at a time. And then another of our values here, the idea that on the one extreme of the continuum, that life is what I do. In other words, there are few givens in life. There are few things that I can't change. So I can change much in life, and there's very little that I have to just accept. That I have the ability as an individual to be and do whatever I want if I actually make the effort to do it. That the happiness, the destiny that I have, it's up to me. That in fact, unhappiness in life it's not normal, and that human beings as individuals are the locus, the center point of control for the fulfillment of life. That's the kind of life is what I do idea. And then on the other extreme in that value area, in cultural value area, is that the idea that life is what happens to me. That there are some things that I just have to live with, that are constraints that are imposed upon my life, that there may be limits that I have no control over as to what I can do and what I can be, that happiness and unhappiness are both just normal parts of life, that human beings are only sometimes the center point of control of these areas, that we can't always control and predict and accomplish what we desire to. So think about your culture and which end of that spectrum or continuum you're on. And then a final value that we would describe here is the view of progress that people differ in so much. That one extreme would say that progress is inevitable. That if change occurs, change is almost always better. It's for the better. That tradition should be scrutinized because it's not always right. Just because we've done it this way in the past doesn't mean we should continue to do it. That we can be optimistic, and that optimism is best, looking to the future. That technology as an agent of change is often an answer. It has solutions. Every problem, in fact, would have an adequate response, a solution to it. And that new is usually better. That new things that are introduced are often supersede and improve old things. That would be one view of a value, that progress in that sense is inevitable and it's valuable. And then the other end of the spectrum would say that progress is not automatic. That in fact, because it's not automatic, that change can actually be for the worse, not for the better. That realism is actually a higher value. That we need to be realistic about change. That tradition for us can be and is a good guide to our description of life problems and our evaluation of life problems. In fact, some of the problems of life can't be solved. We won't be able to solve them. And technology as a resource does not have as many answers as we think it has. It new is not necessarily better for us. And so again, another of those continuums of values. I trust that as you've gone through those, that you've gone ahead and put a mark on where you are in your cultural experience in relationship to those areas. How those things then in examples, think about some concrete examples. I trust you've done that, to think about ways that those values are actually manifest. They're not just abstract ideas, but you say, oh yeah, I can relate to that because this is a way that I see that play out in my life. And then think about this question. Do you really think that someone who didn't know you would be able to fully understand your story, your story of life, what gives meaning and purpose to you from just these things alone? What would it take for someone else to really understand your core identity and worldview? And how easily do you think it would be, let's say someone took the way that you'd given an example in one of these particular values, how easily would it be for that person to really misunderstand your identity just by judging you in those areas, those examples that you've given? I assume that for most of us that we would feel misunderstood, quite misunderstood, in people evaluating our motivation on the basis of just a subset of actions that they see manifest in our lives. And for example, let's think about a concrete example. Let's talk about a scene like this where there are some people who are protesting, which is something we commonly see in our world. They're protesting, in this case, the development of a supermarket in a small Australian town. So let's imagine that you yourself come upon this town and scene, and you're only able to take in initial impressions just by observing. And so what would be some of the observations that you would make? What would be some of the assumptions that you would make about the values that these people might possibly hold to? What kind of people, because we tend to make value judgments very quickly about others. What kind of people do you think that these people are? What kind of conclusions would you come to, in fact, through observation about the convictions that these people hold to? In this discussion, in this example, we're thinking back to our circle model that has the story at its center. Remember that? The life story of an individual, or God's story in the case of a Christian theist that is connected to that. And let's use that model as an example to trace a couple of scenarios in particular from the two of the people in this photograph. Let's recognize, or try to recognize, the ways in which, even though they're both in action participating in a similar event, that differences in value and conviction could motivate them to be participating for different reasons in different ways. So, For example, let's think about a character, one of the ladies here, named Caroline. Okay? Now, in her morals or in her actions, she is primarily, the action that we see manifest is she's attending a protest here against a new supermarket development in her area. Fairly simple. Now, but if we were to unpeel or peel back down to the level of value and ethic for her, we may find, for example, that she's thinking, hey, if I don't do something to protest, who's going to? Who will? That this new development, her value is this new development maybe will increase traffic and pollution, or it's ultimately going to lower my quality of life in this setting. That each of us as an individual, let's say, needs to create our own meaning and pleasure and prosperity in our lives. And so I have to stand up for my individual rights. That may be the place that Carolyn's coming from as a participant in action in this protest, that value is actually part of the core of why she's participating. And because as a conviction for her, let's say, this lady, that she may believe man needs to live by whatever values that he or she determines are best for their own personal happiness and survival, even of the human race as a whole. And so my personal survival affects the human race, and we need to all be able to be happy together. And then as we peel back yet again to the layer of identity, she may be saying, hey, I don't believe there's a God. There aren't any moral absolutes that affect my action in this particular situation. That I act in this way, but I don't really believe that human life has some kind of a transcendent meaning that provides identity for me, because my story, says this person participating, is based on a naturalistic philosophy, scientific method, and so all the real knowledge of life that provide impetus for what we do and that provide for that individual decision-making and identity for me are just based on science anyway. And so I make the decisions that determine the course of action based on that kind of prime reality for my life. And so you see the way in which an action can be manifest, and yet it takes effort to really begin to understand the layers that get to a story, a mindset, a worldview that give impetus to those actions. So that would be maybe Caroline here in this protest. But then let's think about another of the protesters. Let's say it's the man holding the sign. Let's say it's John. That he too, in moral and action, okay, so in moral and action, we're seeing on the surface the same attending of a protest against the supermarket, a new supermarket development in his area. So a very similar action, maybe very even similar attitudes manifest in his face and his posture and what he says and does in that context of protest, maybe very similar. And yet his value and ethic for being involved could be quite different. He may be saying in his mind and in his rationale, I think it's important for me to be publicly communicating my view in this right kind of way, that this new development is going to destroy what I see as an important, let's say, a wetland in our area maybe. And maybe that's, I don't know, maybe the home of an important bird that lives there, and it's important for him in his worldview because those wetlands and animals, birds, are a part of God's creation, and that's valuable. And so you start to hear the value difference there already, right? That he believes that Christians, let's say, John does, that they should show that they care about relevant community and environmental issues. That it's important for Christians to manifest that. And so in that value that he's demonstrating, he's holding to an underlying conviction there that's different, quite different from Caroline's. That John may say, for example, that man has a responsibility, that God's given him a responsibility to look after the things that God created on the earth, and that God himself values those things. And so John may think, hey, I can participate in communicating who God is by expressing publicly that I value these things, and that I can find common ground with others by participating with them in this community event that manifests my value and my conviction in the person of God. And on the level of John's identity, that he sees himself as part of a story that is producing an identity of a God who wants people to know who He is. And that this God wants people to know, to see an identity founded in His Son, this one He has sent. That John may take this opportunity, based on his identity, as a means of reaching people in his community with that message, that he may see this as a way to accomplish that. Because at the core, that John, in this case, is connected to a story of a God who's an infinite and personal being, who created the world. He's very much related to it. He cares about, this God cares about the world, that He gave that world to human beings to care for, and in the process of redeeming humanity, He also gave His Son as a sacrifice for the sins of mankind. And so you hear that difference, don't you? You see the ways in which very different values can be applied to, on the surface, what appear to be similar behaviors or actions. And, when we come into situations cross-culturally, or even in our own cultural settings, we ask ourselves the question, and we should ask the question, what does it take to really discover what someone's true identity is? What does it really take to understand the story that's motivating their identity and their convictions and their values and ultimately their actions? We realize that there's a lot that we can discover through the observation level, but ultimately we're going to need to spend a lot of time with those people in building relationships, getting to know them, getting to understand them, describing the things that they value by listening to their thoughts and relating to them as they live out life, so that we're beginning and growing to understand who they are in their inner person, on the inside, the motivating forces, the motivating impetus of their lives. Now in this case, the picture that I showed you, if we had had opportunity to talk with John and Caroline both, we would have, over listening well, asking good questions, we would have begun to understand that they had different motivations for being in that protest. That even if we met their families, let's say, and took part in the activities of life with them, that we would begin to even more fully see their points of view, see the origin points for their points of view, and we could hear not only their point of view in relationship to this protest, but on a lot of topics of life. Our tendency, coming from certain of our cultural backgrounds, would be to take John and Caroline and instantly categorize them and everybody else in this protest as left-wingers, environmental activists. Whether we think positively or negatively about that stance, we would still tend to assume that we understand a lot about their motivation. And, we should ask ourselves the question, why is it we do that as human beings? The main reason is because we have a cultural script or an existing frame of reference for people who take part in protests and certain kinds of protests. And so our initial thoughts about protesters' values are based on that knowledge or that cultural framework that we already have for this kind of protest. And we probably have a view of what that protest means in the context of, let's say, Australian culture and life in this case. So it's important to know and remember to recognize in ourselves the tendency to ascribe value. That we as human beings don't just go into a situation thinking, I probably don't understand what's fully going on here, and I need to find out more to really understand. I need to suspend judgment to understand. That's not how we tend to approach people in situations. We make very quick judgments, and yet we're suggesting here that there are significant differences in value that motivate behavior, and we need to be more aware of taking that kind of an approach with other people, especially those that are from another cultural background. That we need to build, as we think about worldview and as we move towards learning languages and cultures, that we need to build a greater understanding of broader frameworks or categories or slots for culture that create context options for us in our minds, that we don't just assume that we know the cultural values that might motivate people, that we need to understand the differences that can occur in cultural value. That will be a help to us. Those understandings of reference points or starting points for cultural values, they can provide guides for us as we begin to try to learn to communicate with people in another cultural setting in an appropriate way, in a language that they understand, a society, an environment that they understand, and that we can gradually grow to appreciate relating to their cultural and social environment in the way that they relate to it. And then on that basis, we can begin to develop meaningful relationships that are based on a true understanding of where those people, those individuals are coming from, what their frames of reference are for why they behave the way that they do. That's a really significant place for us to grow as we move toward learning other languages and cultures.